Hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining this August edition of the Tyk Office Hours. I am Buddha, product evangelist here at Tyk, and I'll be hosting this session, this discovery of new opportunities for your business with Tyk. If you're familiar with the Tyk Office Hours format, it's going to be a very demo-driven session where we'll be walking through a few different things, few different activities that you can accomplish with the Tyk's API management platform. And while doing so, I'll explain a couple of the possible opportunities, the possible things that it will enable for your business as we go along. So without further ado, let me go straight into the demo. I'm going to get out of this slide deck mode that we've got. Okay, so there are a couple of things that you do need for this demo to work. I'm going to be using the JSON placeholder APIs that come with it. If you are unfamiliar with it, the URL, I will share the URL in the chat. There we go. It is now in the chat. So if you do want to follow along, feel free to do so. There are a couple of different APIs, REST APIs that are available from this, and that's what we're going to be using for today's demonstration. So we'll be using the users and the to-do list, if you can see it right here. So if we have a closer look at the users API, it essentially gives you a list of 10 users with some specific pieces of information, including the name, username, email, address, etc., etc. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be taking this REST API and we'll be adding that to Tyk's API gateway and then do some API management activities associated with it. We'll be securing it, we'll be rate limiting it, and we'll be then take it a step forward with UDG. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So the other tool that I'm going to be using today is going to be Postman. So Postman, I'm going to be using, if you're familiar, hopefully you are. If you're working in the world of APIs, you would have heard of them. We are going to be using Postman as the tool for sending requests and receiving responses. So essentially just the request response for today and for the REST side of things. So how do we get started? So the easiest way to get started is if you were to head over to tyk.io, which is our website. Now, right on top, you have the install option. You've got try for free here as well. I'm going to hit install. And you'll get two choices over here, whether you want to install this on our cloud, which is going to be our Tyk Cloud product, which is our SaaS offering that we've got going. Today, we're going to be staying away from that. We are actually going to go and set this up and show you how to set it up on your infrastructure. So for that, let's go ahead. And this infrastructure could actually be anything. It could be your laptop. It could be AWS. It could be Azure. So anything that is owned and managed by you in this case. So any data center, any server of your choosing. So I'm going to hit install. And it's going to ask me a couple of questions, which I will answer. I've got it pre-filled over here, as you can see. Just a few details about yourself, where you're from, and what your main goal is. You've got a couple of options if you want to choose something different from here, and a few details about your use case and where you heard. How did you hear about us? So I'm just going to put in, if you've come here because of this event, then feel free to add that as your option right here. There are a couple of other options. If you do want to get a call back from our team to help you with the setup in any possible way, then feel free to check this right now. Hopefully with this process, you won't need any further help, at least to get started. For the use case that come beyond that, then we are always here to help you out. I'm going to hit agree to terms and conditions, and I'm going to start my free trial. Okay, easy peasy. I've got it all signed up and ready to go. There are a couple of commands that are on my screen, which I'm going to be going over very, very shortly. There is one prerequisite for this self-managed installation, which is Docker. So if you've got Docker going on, if you've got Docker installed already, then no issues. If you haven't, then please do so before you proceed with running the commands on your screen. There are multiple other ways in which you can install the self-managed deployment option with Tyk. You can install it on Kubernetes. You can install it in several other ways, all of which is documented on our documentation website. So feel free to browse those. For today, we're going to be doing this using Docker. So what do we need to do next? I'm going to be opening up my iTerm, which is what I've got going right here, which is all ready to go. And I'm going to copy this command and head on over and just paste it. So as you can see, just cloning the Git repository and creating and putting that inside a Tyk Pro Docker demo folder. So I'm going to hit enter. It's got it. It's cloned it. It's all done. Now, so for the next step, we have the Docker Compose up. Now, before you do this, there is one single thing that you need to do. And there are a couple of ways in which you can do it. So you can follow this along, hit Docker Compose up and enter the license key on the screen that follows. But there is another method in which you can do it, which is to just do it from the code edit using a code editor, which is what I'm going to show you. It's a little bit more, it's a little better way of doing it. So I've got Sublime Text open over here. I've got my Tyk Pro Docker demo installation going already. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go back to my iTerm and I'm going to create a new file called .env. So touch.env. And I've got my .env file. This is where my license key is going to reside. I've got my variable name, which is the Tyk _db_ license key. I do have a license key available here. Once you've signed up, this license key will arrive in your email ID. So do feel free to check that and add your own license key. I'm using my own version right now, and I'm going to save that. I'm going to go back out into my iTerm, and now I'm going to copy the Docker Compose up, back out here, paste it, and it will get me up and running. So back to my browser. And if you see here, it's going to tell me navigate to localhost 3000 for access. So I'm going to go localhost 3000 and I'm already signed in. So in your case, you may not get the sign in automatically because I've done this before. It has retained some of my sign in information. In your case, you may get sort of a bootstrap screen where you need to add a bit of a few details about your organization and set up a username and password. For me, it was already set up, and therefore I get straight to the Tyk dashboard. So now, Tyk as a product, what is Tyk as a product? So Tyk's platform is a cloud-native API management platform. It is powered by an open source API gateway, which is pretty much the brains of the operation behind everything that happens here. All the computation, all the processing happens at the open source API gateway level. And it's the same API gateway, the same open source gateway that powers every single one of our products that we've got. We don't have any upgraded gateway beyond the open source. The open source gateway is powerful enough to be a standalone product in itself, as well as power all of our enterprise suite of products, as you will see. Beyond that, we do what you're seeing right here is the Tyk dashboard, which is a really nice, easy to use graphic user interface for you to interact with all of the different capabilities of the API gateway, the Tyk gateway. So you'll see how easy it is, and we'll walk through the process with a little bit of an introduction into the different elements and the different activities that we want to accomplish using it. And then finally, the final component that I want to talk about is the developer portal. So Tyk developer portal is a very simple way to publish, catalog, and expose your APIs and API products for consumption by third-party developers and partners. So as a simple suite of products, if you think about it, we've got the gateway, we've got the developer portal, we've got the dashboard as your enterprise product. Powering a lot of this, the observability layer of it is the Tyk Pump, which is essentially responsible for all of the analytics, the logs, the data that you see here on this screen, as well as it's capable of pushing information, pushing data to third-party systems as well, which could be your business intelligence tools, could be your monitoring, alerting systems that are existing within your organization. So a little tour of the Tyk dashboard. Right now I'm using the latest version that is out there, which is 5.1. So this is the Tyk activity dashboard. It gives you a bit of an overview of the different API calls that have been made, some of the errors, some of the latencies associated with it. It'll give you the breakdown of different errors. So I have just recently run a demo this morning, and therefore you see some activity from today. as well as in preparation yesterday. So what we want to do, there are obviously a few different options that you can go and explore at your own pace, at your own time. We've got the log browser here that'll give you all of the different API calls that you might have made. What I want to go over is the API section. So under system management, you go straight into APIs. And within APIs, you may have this as completely empty. Once again, I have done a couple of demos, and therefore you see a couple of examples that are already here. What we will do next is to add our user API, if you remember, to Tyk. So the way to do that is to click Add New API. I'm going to be using HTTP. I'm going to give this a name. I'm going to say user REST, and I need my API URL. Hit configure. And as soon as you do that, you get a few different options over here, which is pre-configured for you, the ease of use that you may want. And then what I want to do next is just go all the way down, which is the authentication section. I'm going to change this to open keyless just for this segment of the demonstration. We will change that back to a more secure setting very shortly. But for now, I'm going to hit save. So once that's done, my API is now mounted on the Tyk gateway, and it is ready for me to call. So let me click that. I can technically just go straight to the browser and do this. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to head over to Postman and hit the URL here. And we're going to be using this. We'll be using Postman to do this anyway. So I think it's better to have everything here. So as you can see, so this on the face of it does not seem like a big change because you're swapping one URL to the other. But at the core of it, if you really want to understand what's happening here, is that we have our REST API now being routed through the Tyk API gateway. Now, why would you want to do this? Now, one of the opportunity here is, one of the reasons for doing this would be that you may not want access, all of your APIs to be accessible by general public or just directly calling the upstream. You want there to be some sort of a guardrail. You want there to be some sort of a proxy to be able to make calls to your services, to make calls to your APIs, and that's where your API gateway would come in. So imagine having a system of different services internally, which you want to expose either in its entirety or by parts, by means of APIs, and Tyk Gateway is going to enable you to actually direct traffic into your services from the external traffic that comes in. So hopefully that makes a little bit of sense. Again, we are going towards making your overall API stack more and more secure. That is the core of it. The core essence is that we want to have a more secure stack, a more reliable stack. The opportunity comes once we have those foundational building blocks already in there. Your stability, your stability and security, once that's taken care of, then you start thinking about the possible opportunities of monetization. You start thinking about the possible opportunities of productization. How do you then take the next step of building better products on top of this? So which is why these core components, these core elements, these core steps are very, very essential in building those strong foundations for you as an organization, for you as a developer, for you as a platform team. So with that, right now, it's still an open API. Anyone who has access to this URL will be able to make a call to this API. It is slightly more secure than calling the URL, the upstream URL directly, but we are not satisfied yet. What we want to do next is we want to make sure that this API is only available to those with an API key. So anyone who has been granted permission to use this API will be able to make use of this API. So how do we do that? Let's go back into our Tyk dashboard. I'm going to close some of these off so that it doesn't interfere. Okay, so the first thing that I'm going to do is, remember the authentication method that we had changed? Let's change that back to authentication token. I'm going to hit update. And once we do that, now immediately what you would see is if I go over to Postman and hit send, it's going to say authorization field missing. So immediately the open access has been revoked. You cannot access this API anymore, which is exactly what we wanted in this case. So how do we then grant access to people that we want to grant access to? So the method that we're going to be using for this case, for this instance, is going to be authentication token. As you can see, there are many different methods that are available as part of Tyk's API management platform. You have JSON Web Tokens, you've got OAuth 2.0, you have custom authentication, Go plugins. All of those options are available. For the sake of simplicity today, we're going to be looking at authentication token, which is a popular way to authenticate your APIs. So what's next? Now, what you need in order to access your API now is an API key. There are two ways in which you can create an API key. One is to create the API key on a per API basis, which is going to be perfectly fine for this use case because we only have one API. But now, as an organization, that may not be the case. You may have multiple APIs. You may have 100 APIs. You may have even 1,000 APIs, in which case managing API keys on a per API basis can be really, really challenging. It can be really cumbersome and can be really difficult to manage on a long-term basis. So how do we solve that? The way we address that issue is through policies. Policies define the rules of engagement for your APIs or your API keys specifically. So it's a two-step process. So whatever has been defined at the policy level is what's inherited by the API key. And every API that is using that API key will have all of those rules, all of those policies enforced upon those APIs. So we'll see that in action now. So how do we create that? Let's go over to policies. And I'm going to add a new policy. I can choose my API from here. And once again, this is fairly flexible. So you can choose your APIs at any point of time, or you can leave it empty as well if you wanted to and choose your API later on. Right now, I'm just going to choose this, head on over to configurations. I'm going to call this user policy. I'm going to give this an expiration date, expiration time. I'm going to just have it for 1 hour because I don't need it beyond this demo, which again, depending on the policy of your API key management, you may have different ways of handling this. So I'm going to create the policy. The second step is to now create the API key using this policy. So I'm going to go head over to my keys, add a key, and I'm going to be applying a policy instead of choosing an API. So user policy. And it has already inherited all of the different rules of engagement that was defined and as part of the policy. I'm going to hit create key. So I've got my key now. If I head back over to Postman, I'm going to go to my headers. And I'm going to go over to authorization and paste in this key. Once we do that, we've got back our API. So now your API is completely secure. It's only available for access by anyone who has this API key or authentication token. Once again, this is a basic security requirement, but even beyond that, if you wanted to think about why you would want to do something like this, it might again be that you don't want an open API. You want people to pay for access for your API. And this may be one of the ways in which you accomplish that. Or it might just be a basic security requirement. And that's all as part of your core infrastructure. You want to have it. If you're looking at opportunity for growth, then this might be part of your subscription policy potentially, or your access policy for external users. So that's your security. That is your step 2 that has now been completed. What else can we do with policies? We spoke about rules of engagement. So far, we've only seen access. What else can we do? So let's go back to policies. I'm going to go into user policy, and under here, as part of your global limits and quotas, there are a couple of things that you see here. We've got rate limiting, we've got throttling, we've got usage quota. So we're going to be looking at rate limiting. Rate limiting is essentially the number of API calls that can be made, number of calls that can be made to your API over a period of time. In this case, over a certain number of seconds. So let's see that in action. Let's say we want to do 3 API calls over a period of 10 seconds. I'm going to hit update, go back out. And what it should do, well, why not just show you? 1, 2, 3, and 4. So it's rate limiting me at the end of 3 requests. It's only permitting me to make 3 API calls back to my server through the API gateway, through Tyk's API gateway during a course of 10 seconds. Now, every 10 seconds, it is going to refresh. Therefore, while I was explaining all of that, that would have refreshed already and the cycle would restart. So now, why would you want to do this? Now, there might be a few different ways, a few different reasons for you to do that. Again, at a very basic core infrastructure level, this might be part of your load management. You might want to have rate limits. You might want to set limits over your API so that your servers do not get overwhelmed. It's also potentially a way to manage your traffic, manage potential threats, which might be in the form of DDoS attacks potentially. So you don't, once again, you don't want overwhelming number of API requests coming into your server and therefore bringing it down and making your service unavailable. Now, the other part of it, so once the core is taken care of, we talk about the opportunity. The opportunity here, again, once again, is about potentially subscription tiers. Now, typically subscription tiers aren't handled through rate limits. They're handled through quotas, which is essentially the same thing, just over a longer period of time. And really, this could be part of your monetization strategy, where you, at a free tier, you might want to restrict the number of API calls that someone could make over a period of time, versus, say, a paid tier, where you may want to remove all of these different limits. And you can handle that by creating two different policies, one which has, say, the ability to make 100 API calls per minute versus an unlimited number of calls per minute. So you can do that as well very easily from here. Now, one other thing is this, as the name suggests, is a global limit. What about the section here, which is if you go down to API access, you also have set per API limits and quotas. Now, imagine a situation where, as an organization, you have 100 different APIs, and there is one policy that is managing the rules of engagement for all of these different 100 APIs. However, there is one API that needs to be handled a little bit differently. Now, for the most part, all the rules of engagement are the same, except for one thing, which is this rate limit. So instead of having 3 API calls over a period of 10 seconds, you want to make 5 for one specific API. So how do you do that? So on a per API basis, you just enable your set per API limits and quotas. And what this does is essentially overrides the global limits. I'm going to hit update. So what will happen now, if you see the global is 3 and your, well, per API, the per API limit is at 5. So it will allow me to make 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 requests before it hits the rate limit. So this is one way to override your rate limit setting from a global to a per API basis, if you had to change that. So that's about it. That is what I wanted to show you at the very beginning, just to give you a bit of a sense of what you can accomplish with REST APIs in a very, very short period of time. This is literally, believe me when I say this, we are just scratching the surface. There is still plenty of things that we can go into. We can talk about the API designer. We can talk about the versioning systems that we've got. We can talk about potentially adding plugins and creating custom plugins on top of it, the existing plugins that are already part of it. As I've shown you before, there is a log browser, which shows you all of the different API calls that are being made. You can go, right now it doesn't have a whole lot of details, but if you wanted to enable, say, detailed logging, you can do that as well by just going into your API, enable detailed logging, and hit update. And what this will do is it'll give you a little bit more of a verbose log as you go along. So if I hit send, for instance, right now, and I go back out to the log browser, I think the latest request you will see has the request response in its entirety. So you've got all of these different, so we are literally scratching the surface at this point of time. If you do have specific questions around how to manage your REST APIs, whether that is from a security standpoint, whether that is from a versioning standpoint, whether that is from a analytics or monitoring standpoint, feel free to send in your questions. Feel free to ask in the chat if you wanted to do so. With that in mind, we are about halfway through our time. What I wanted to do and show you next is something that we are super excited about, which we call the Universal Data Graph. Now, the Universal Data Graph is our own creation, and it enables you to do 2 things. It was born out of 2 key critical needs. One was, how do we organizations asking this question: how do we move from REST APIs to GraphQL? We see the importance, we see the value of GraphQL in its flexibility, in the way it enables you to build richer applications, but there is a big investment that is needed for me to move from my existing infrastructure into a GraphQL-based infrastructure, both from a resource perspective, infrastructurally, as well as from a developer resource perspective. So UDG is the answer to that problem. It enables you to transform your REST API, your REST data source, into a GraphQL API in a low-code manner. And I'll show you just how simple that entire process is and how little time it will take for you to do that. The amount of knowledge that you need is basically limited to just having basic understanding of GraphQL. That is it. You do not have to write your middleware. You do not have to write any kind of resolvers. You do not have to do any of that heavy lifting. We do that for you. Universal Data Graph makes your life easy. But we didn't want to stop just there. The other issue that we have faced within organization is the problem of data silos. There are multiple different systems and solutions that are being used today as part of the enterprise, as part of an organization. And all of those tools, platforms have data in some form or the other. Now, all of this data is really, really valuable. Now, some of that may be siloed away. That is perfectly fine. But a lot of this data, when they talk to each other, when they are unified together, make for richer experiences, richer applications, better insights, which translate into better decisions for your product and for your business. So we have made that easy as well. The Universal Data Graph makes it possible for you to combine data from different data sources, whether that is REST, whether that is GraphQL, whether that is Kafka data streams, into one single unified data graph and exposing it through a GraphQL API. If that hasn't blown your mind yet, I will show you the demo and hopefully it will do that at that point of time. So let's dive right in. I'll show you exactly what I'm talking about. We're going to be using the same example, the user example that we saw, the user REST endpoint. What we will do is we're going to be using two REST APIs. Let's start off with user and I'll go into the second one shortly. So let's head over to our API section, or you can go straight into the data graph section. And I'm going to add data graph. So it says design a data graph. I'm going to just give it a name. Let's say user UDG. I'm going to go next. And as you see, there's a little bit of a difference here. But before I show you the difference, let's go all the way down. I'm just going to remove the authentication and make it keyless. Once again, just for this part. Hit save and go back. Our API has now been mounted onto the API gateway, Tyk's API gateway. Now, as you can see, there are a couple of changes here. First of all, you get access to a schema. So this is a bare bones shell of a schema. Obviously, we're going to be working through this. If you're familiar with GraphQL, then you will know you've got queries, you've got mutations. You also have subscriptions. Queries enable you to request, retrieve information. Mutations enable you to manipulate information, manipulate data, your adds, deletes, and updates. Subscriptions enable you to get access to real-time data streams, which, again, we're not going to be talking about. It is a section of its own. So in fact, we're not even going to look into mutations today. So we're going to restrict ourselves to queries for now, which is fine. Let's get started with the simple stuff, and let's do that right. First thing that I want to do here is I'm going to create a new type. And let me see if I can make this a little bit bigger for your benefit. Now, if you look at the structure of the user API, there are a few different fields here. You've got ID, name, username, email. Now, you can choose to map out all of these different fields if you wanted to, or you can choose to map out a subset of this. So I'm just going to do, for the sake of simplicity, a subset of this. I'm just going to pick the ID, name, and email. So I'm going to create a type user. I'm going to be creating ID of type int, because it's a number. I'm going to be creating name of type string. And I'm going to be creating email also of type string. Okay, we have this. Now we want to be able to call this or query this information. So let's say I want to get all users, get all users. And the return type of this is going to be, well, an array of users or a list of users. Now, obviously, right now it is not connected to any data source. So I'm going to go zoom out a little bit and hit get all users. This is where you get to define your data source. Now I'm going to be using a REST data source, external data source. I'm going to give it a name. Let's call it users. I'm going to take the URL from here, add it. Method is going to be get, hit save, and hit update on my overall API. All right. So now there is an internal playground that is already built here. So you can choose to use this. I'm going to switch to light so that it's a little bit more visible. And I'm going to be querying this. Let's say get all users. I want my ID. I want my name, and I want my email. And what it should do here is, voila, we have our REST data being queried through GraphQL API, or GraphQL query. And that took all of maybe 60 seconds, I think, maybe a little bit more than 60 seconds. So that is how simple it is. Now, if you were to recreate this yourself, you'll have to write a full resolver to be able to handle the fetching of the REST API. You'll have to host that information somewhere. All of this is taken care of. We've got you covered. We've got you sorted. And, you've got your API managed. Now, that's what we do. All right. Now, obviously, this is the internal playground. There is also an option for an external playground. The way you can use that is to go into core settings, head on, scroll down a little bit, and you'll see enable API playground. This is for external folks. The internal playground is for people who have access to your API dashboard. Not everyone's going to have access to the Tyk dashboard. You don't want to do that. So for people who want external access, we enable the playground, update it, head on, take our URL and say playground. And this gives back our GraphQL playground once again. And we can do exactly the same thing that we did. Let's say get all users, ID, name, and email. And we'll get back the response. Now, I told you about two possible use cases, two use cases that we had really focused on. First one was the transformation of REST to GraphQL. Now let's talk about unifying data from different data sources. So now what we want to do is we've got our users. In fact, before we go into unifying data sources, let's see if we can take it a step further. Let's say we don't want to get the list of all users, but we want to query information about a specific user by ID. Now, the way that is enabled in this REST API is by saying /user ID. And that will give me information about that particular user. Now I can say there are 10 users here, so I can say user ID 10 will give me that information. So let's see if we can recreate this as well. So I'm going to go back to my schema and zoom in once again so that you can see it. I'm going to create yet another query. So I'm going to say get user. In this case, I need a parameter, which is going to be the ID of the user of type int, not 0. And in this case, I'm going to be getting back just the one user, not a list. So that's all I need. I'm going to hit get user to define the data source. Zoom out a little again. Go to my REST, call it just user this time. That is not it. Let me grab hold of that URL. Now, I can't obviously leave it to 10 because this will hard code 10 as the user ID, and therefore it will only give me, no matter what ID I put in, it will give me information about user ID number 10. But what if we wanted to make it dynamic? So let's say we want to add that as whatever we put in our argument is the user that we query. So in order to do that, open curly braces, and it will automatically give you a drop-down menu. I want to choose the argument ID. Hit my get, save, update. And now if I go back to my playground, and instead of saying get all users, I say get user. Here, the ID is going to be, say, 5, just so that you know that I'm not cheating. I should get back my, am I making a mistake here? Let's see if I have to refresh this a little. Okay. Let's say we do get user. Five. Let's do ID once again, name and email. Same thing that we did before. And here we go. You've got ID number 5, user number 5 is available. Chelsea is, and her detail is available here. I can change that dynamically to 1, and that'll give me user ID number 1. Can change that to 10, and it'll give me back 10. So there you have it. That is the more dynamic nature of querying. It is not just hard coding URLs from REST to GraphQL. It's got a dynamic component to it as well. Now, over to our combining of data sources. Now, what we want to do here is every user does have an associated to-do list. Now, that's not part of this particular REST API, but if you want to access it, you go into /user/ID/to-dos, which is a separate API altogether. So if you were to build an application right now where you want to list out the to-dos by, as well as the details of that user, you will have to make this combination yourself. You'll have to write the logic to combine that using the user ID and the ID and do all of that yourself. We have made that simple as well. So let's see how that works. Let's go over to the Tyk dashboard and over to my schema once again. So here, I'm going to define a new type now, which is going to be of type to-do. So if you look at the structure of this, it has user ID, ID, title, and completed. We're going to be taking all of that. So let's take all of that. Now zoom in once again and hit type to-do. In this case, I'm going to say ID is of type int. This is the ID of the to-do, not the user ID. User ID is handled by this. Then we have the title, which is going to be a string, and completed, which is going to be a Boolean. You can have that as a string as well, but because if you look at this data, it is just false and true, so Boolean works as well. And now I want to add this to my user data. So when I query a user, I have the ability to query their to-do information as well. So let's say to-dos. And this is going to give me a list of to-dos. So now I'm going to just zoom out once again and define this data source. It's going to be REST. Let's see, to-dos. I'm going to be copying this. Now, once again, we want it to be dynamic. So I'm just going to remove this. And in this case, I want the object ID of type user. So because this is going to be, what we want is this ID that's coming in, not the argument ID. So that's what we want. We want /to-dos of method get and hit save. Update the API. And now if I go back to my playground, hit refresh, make an API call. Let's say we've got get user. ID is 1. I'm going to say ID, name, all the usual stuff, the usual suspects. But now you'll see there is a to-dos section here as well. And I'm going to hit ID here as well, user ID, title, and well, I think completed. So now if everything has gone well, it will give me, voila, it will give me the information of the user as well as the to-do list of that particular user. Now I can change this up, obviously, if we have, say, user number 4, if they have user, there you go, if they've got to-dos to do, which are incomplete as well, are completed, we can see all of that. Now you can change that up completely and make this get all users. So it'll get the list of information for all of the different users. As you can see, all 10 of them. So you can have all of that and you can have some fun with it as well. So there you have it. That is your universal data graph at a very, very simple level. But let me see how much time we've got. Okay, we're 45 minutes in. I don't want to stop here because ultimately, Tyk is a full lifecycle API management product. So what we want to do is we don't want to stop at just the UDG. I want to show you how you can do all of the stuff that we did with REST on this GraphQL API as well, which is securing it, adding query depth limits to it, maybe even rate limiting it. So we'll see how we can accomplish that really, really quickly. So let's go over back to our Tyk dashboard. Now, if you remember, we had changed this to open keyless. Let's change that to authentication token, hit update. And once again, you will immediately see that it has restricted my access. I'm going to head back over. If you remember, and you've been following along, you will remember that you have to create a policy, this time with user UDG. I'm going to give it a name, user UDG policy. Also expires in an hour. And create a policy. Head over to our keys, add a key, and create it. Okay. Copy this, head back over to our API playground, look at request headers, open this up, and we need to add an authorization header and add the API key. What this should do is give me back my API data. It'll give me back all of the data that we used for the user for the universal data graph. All right, that is our secured UDG GraphQL API now. What else can we do? Let's go back into our policies. And within the policy, go to the global limits and quotas. Again, you can have your rate limit. It works exactly the same way. So I'm not going into that. What is unique in this case is the query depth limit. So if you were to hit this and say, I want to restrict the depth of my queries to just 2, hit update. What this will do is it will, so let's talk about why this is important. So the reason why query depths are important, limiting query depths are important is because A, your GraphQL is very, very flexible. GraphQL APIs tend to be very flexible. That is the nature of it. Therefore, it has a lack of predictability in terms of the way a user or a developer is going to be making a call to your data, to your endpoint. You could have your fields in any particular order if they wanted and as deep as they wanted if your API permits you to do so. Now, while that might be necessary in certain situations, once again, you may face the issue of malicious folks trying to bring down your server by going very, very deep into your data tree, which is something that you want to avoid. The deeper that goes, the more computation that is needed, and therefore there is possibility of your service becoming unavailable. So to remedy that, at a very base core infrastructure level, at a security level, you can limit your depths. But once again, it gives you the opportunity to actually create a policy where you have a free tier, you have a paid tier. Free tier has limited number of query depths, whereas the paid tier potentially has unlimited numbers. So completely up to you. Opportunities are available if you wanted to take them. I've hit update already, so I'm going to head over to show you what that looks like. Right now, if I go to my playground, sorry, not that. Right now I've got 1, 2, 3. So my depth right now is at 3. We have only permitted 2. So if I hit this, it's going to tell me that my query depth limit has been exceeded. I'm going to get rid of my to-dos and I get it back. So that in essence is how query depth limits work. Okay, that is that. I think that's all that I wanted to show you. There is one other thing. Obviously, there's the developer portal, which is a thing of its own. I've deliberately kept it separate from this because you want to pick that up in a separate session. There is a whole lot of API productization, monetization conversations, all of those different things about how you manage subscriptions, how you manage policies, and what kind of impact it has on the analytics. The usage of your APIs by third-party developers comes under the category of your developer portal. So we'll take that up in a separate session. We want to spend a little bit more time than a rush job. Today, my purpose was to show you how easy it is for you to get up and running with the Tyk API platform on your own infrastructure, manage your REST APIs, unify your REST APIs into GraphQL APIs, or even transform single REST endpoints into GraphQL APIs, and manage them as well, manage your GraphQL APIs. So UDG, in essence, once it has been created, is a GraphQL API. Therefore, you can manage it as any other GraphQL API if you had one. If you already have a GraphQL API, you can manage it in exactly the same way that you saw in this final segment, which is adding your security, adding your query depth limits, adding your rate limits. All of that works perfectly fine. So with that, hopefully this gave you a bit of a primer into the world of API management, what Tyk has to offer, the possible core infrastructural needs that you can address using Tyk, as well as the possible business opportunities that you would have enabled by Tyk as well. So once again, scratching the surface, there's a whole lot that we can dive into, but hopefully this gave you a good understanding of what we've got in store for you. So tell us what your experience was all about. Tell us what you felt about the session. Until next time, we're going to be hosting these sessions on an ongoing basis. First Tuesday of every month from here on in till the end of this year is going to be Tyk Office Hours. So if you missed this one, don't worry. If you've got questions, don't worry. You can bring that, always bring that onto our next session, onto our next session. If you don't want to wait, feel free to email me, reach out to me on LinkedIn. With that, thank you so much for joining me. Until next time, take care and have a lovely rest of the day. Bye-bye.